Welcome to Culture, Worldview, and Origins. This series is on critical thinking skills in science. We're on Chapter 6, Knowledge and Wisdom, session number 5. We're looking at now a non-Western view of knowledge. In the previous sessions, we looked at knowledge as defined by the Western view, and the Western view of knowledge is more something cognitive. It's something book learned. It's something that is studied and is researched. The non-Western perspective of knowledge is a little different. The reason for that difference has to do with the structure of the house. The last series we looked at was a Western view of knowledge, and understanding that the house in the Western view does not include culture, does not include experience. It starts right at the foundation, which is the source of reliable knowledge, and they choose a source and then think that they have a one-to-one relationship with that knowledge, that whatever they experience is exactly the way it is. It is identical. In the non-Western view, they start with culture on the bottom, and realizing that that culture influences their source of reliable knowledge and what they accept as a source of reliable knowledge. Now, what we're looking at is a non-Western view, and again, I believe that a lot of the cultures were a non-Western perspective, or maybe most of the world was a non-Western perspective at one time, because they all had a belief in gods, they all had a belief in powers and in supernatural, and in how things were created and where knowledge came from. But then there was a movement that really began in Greece, but it's summarized here by this writing by Brian McGee. Where in his book, The History of Philosophy, he states, the first philosophers were making two great breaks with the past simultaneously. In the first place, they were trying to understand the world by use of their reason without appealing to religion, revelation, or authority, or tradition. So there was a movement happening. The ancient Greece was actually a non-Western culture where they had a lot of information that was gathered through the senses, that was gathered through experience. But it was these philosophers that came along and said, no more of this religion, no more revelation, no more authority, no more tradition, no more accumulating knowledge from our ancestors. We're going to go out and get it ourselves, and it's going to be a different kind of knowledge. Well, in that is called an epistemology. How we get to knowledge has to do with the four branches in philosophy, and the branch that has to do with knowledge, the source of knowledge and the methods of getting knowledge, is called epistemology. There is a different epistemology that is called ethno-epistemology. It is a field of study that explores how different cultures understand knowledge, truth, and belief. By examining these concepts through a cultural lens, ethno-epistemology highlights the diversity of epistemic practices across various societies. So what this is about is how different cultures get reliable knowledge. What is their sources? How do they come to it? These are all quotes from articles, published articles. I haven't included all the sites or citations. I can do that. I do have that information. But in this one article, it says, persons taught to use all their senses, to absorb every clue to interpreting a complex dynamic reality, may well smile at the illusion that words alone stripped of complementary sound and color and texture, can convey meaning adequately. What's he pointing at? He's saying that the Western way of getting knowledge, Western knowledge, that's detached from experience, detached from life, is not real knowledge. It's not reliable, and it's not enduring, is it? It's not enduring. Indigenous perspective on knowing. The need to walk on the land in order to know it is a different approach than the one-dimensional, literate approach to knowing. How does an indigenous get to know something? By experience, by walking it, by interacting with it. And that is firsthand knowledge of how something happens, of how this works, of how that. So it's not a detached pyramid of knowledge and then understanding and then applying it somewhere. In the indigenous format, it's knowledge that is gained through experience. I mean, it's applied. It's already working. It's already, because if the knowledge doesn't work, they don't eat. They don't survive. They don't, and so their knowledge is very pragmatic. It's very practical. It's knowledge that is gained through experience. Maybe experience that was successful, and maybe a lot of them that were not. Again, in fact, in the prevailing Eurocentric concept of school, knowledge, an accumulation of specific information, concepts, and skills within a school subject, has no direct translation. Okay, in fact, in the prevailing Eurocentric concept of school, knowledge has no direct translation into most indigenous languages, because the Eurocentric concept of knowledge is largely foreign to most indigenous worldviews. So indigenous epistemology, their definitions. We looked over definitions before of knowledge, and we can find definitions of knowledge, and those definitions are detached from experience. They're just defined right there. There they are. They're in the dictionary. In most indigenous languages, there is no comparable term, word, for the Western knowledge. It's just they have things, it's largely foreign to them. Then how do they define language? Or how do they define knowledge? Well, it says the best English expression for what indigenous peoples express as knowledge is ways of living, for which the word learn means coming to knowing. Okay, a lot of the vocabulary in a Western context are nouns and adjectives. They're static, and they describe things. Adjectives. But in a indigenous, non-Western, they're verbs. They're action. They're not descriptions of something, they're actions of doing something. So what is knowledge to an indigenous people group? That word that has related to knowledge in the Western is ways of living. So in other words, it's knowledge is something that affects our way of living. And if it doesn't affect our way of living, then maybe we don't have any use for that knowledge. But so it's kind of like their expression of our term for knowledge is ways of living, for which the word learn means coming, verb, to knowing, another verb. Everything is action orientated. Again, another quote from an indigenous philosopher. Knowledge is not a commodity that can be possessed or controlled by educational institutions, but is a living process to be absorbed and understood. Okay, a lot of our educational system, knowledge is power. Knowledge is control. Knowledge is learned through school. Knowledge is, and so it's a commodity that we buy and sell. And what the indigenous are saying is that knowledge is not a commodity that can be possessed or controlled by educational institutions, but is a living process to be absorbed and understood. In the indigenous world, to be educated, to be intelligent, to be smart is to live well, is to be able to live in the context of what surrounds them, is to be able to live off the land, is be able to have a relationship with the land that they live on. And frankly, I would not do very well. Maybe in a academic context, I'm okay. In a Western, in a non-Western, real-world context, I would die because I cannot take care of myself. I depend on going to the store to buy food, to buy things that would be necessary to live by. You take away all those stores and you put me out in the middle of a wilderness or out in a jungle and I wouldn't last very long. And so it's kind of like, okay, so who's the intelligent one? The one that has the degree, the diploma, or the one that has life experience that can actually do something in his surroundings. Here's a listing contrasting, and again, this is not my list, even though I've put together lists, but I found this one in a publication, and it parallels very much lists that we have put together. The Western side. I'm going to go over here a little bit more or try to get out of the way. The Western side, the belief that ancestors were entirely wrong or mostly wrong, or their ideas weren't good. They were expired. They weren't, so it's kind of like the ancestors were mostly wrong, or ideas could be substantially improved upon. Whereas in the indigenous is that their belief that their ancestors were right. We living in a progressive society, we believe that our parents really didn't have that much knowledge. And so they weren't that smart, intelligent, because the knowledge that has come so much now through technology, we're the smart ones. So we don't really study history and traditions. They don't mean that much. But for the indigenous, the traditions and the belief of their ancestors, they believe they were right. And now when we look at the half-life of knowledge, you can see that the indigenous knowledge is still with us. They haven't changed what they believe and how they practice, but yet the Western world has. The second one, belief in a reductionist and deterministic society. In other words, they reduce things. The Westerner idea is to take things apart, reduce things down, and to look at and focus on one specific little part of reality. And that is what we as Westerners tend to do in our analyzing. Analyze means to take apart, means to look at things and break it down into its component parts, whereas the indigenous they believe in an undivided reality. They believe in a reality that you cannot divide, that it's all related. It's all, you can't take out this one piece and study it because it only works as a harmony in the whole system. For the Western, Knowledge is situated in the material world and centered around the Gregorian calendar. So knowledge is situated in the material world. Well, what is knowledge? Knowledge is books. Knowledge is information. For the indigenous, knowledge is situated within more expansive concepts of space, dimensions of reality, and time. Knowledge is everything. Knowledge is of the whole system, is of the whole planet, the harmony. The Western side, human experience is separated from the natural world. Yes, I think I know what they mean by this. That human experience on the Western side calls the natural world the only world, but human experience is separate from the natural world, meaning that they study for knowledge in a school setting, and that's separated from the real world of experience. Whereas the indigenous ways of being and science are constructed as part of the natural world. Natural world meaning the world that they commonly experience, the world that they live in. So in other words, knowledge on one side is situated, one, in a school, and two, it's bound by the material world. Where in the indigenous, knowledge is situated within the more expansive concepts, and it's not limited to the material world. It's very much involving their belief system and the spirit world. Further down, Western ideas tends to focus on only the observable dimensions of reality. That's because in the Western world of thinking, we have relegated reality to what the scientific method can determine for us. And that is based on observation. So again, tends to focus only on the observable dimensions of reality is because of the scientific method. But in the indigenous is belief in multiple dimensions of reality, which are not limited by human senses, by the human experience. Next one, tends to focus on a scarcity of resources, primarily driven by a conflation of want and need. Okay, what the Western world is driven for more and never satisfied with what it has, so therefore the world is going to run out because the world is not satisfied nor content with what it has. It knows it's always going to need more. But on the indigenous side, the belief that there are sufficient resources to meet everyone's need because they are content with what they have. They are not in a system that is progressive, that is always reaching for something higher, better, newer, and just the next step above. The Westerner tends to focus on the present and to a lesser extent in the future. And that's true, but I would almost say that they look at the future just as much. Because we're always concerned about tomorrow and whether or not we're going to have enough resources to satisfy us for tomorrow. But how can we think that we're going to be satisfied maybe for tomorrow when we're not satisfied with today's resources? But the indigenous is belief in the expansive concepts of time in which the past, present, and future are mutually influencing. Or as like in God, he's outside of the parameters of time. So the past, present, and future are equal. They're happening at the same time. Last one. On the Western side, actions tend to focus on the present and both immediate and near future. That's true in that actions are not predicated on history, on tradition, on what we've always done, and the actions are to cushion or to meet the future needs. But for the indigenous worldview, their actions are focused on how they will impact not just now, not just yesterday, but for the next 7 generations. Now, this is written by an indigenous, so this is their view of a Western view and their view of the indigenous view. So it's kind of like they aren't just thinking about now, an impact of now, but they're thinking about how is that going to impact us down the road. Okay, so that is a comparison of 2 different worldviews, how they view things. And so that is how they view knowledge. The view of knowledge is very different from a Western epistemology versus a non-Western ethno-epistemology. This quote is from the indigenous philosopher and historian Vine Deloria. Proposed that there are literally millions of observed facts which simply do not appear in scientific writing because they would tend to raise doubts about the prevailing paradigm. Again, that kind of mirrors what Stephen Jay Gould says about the choosing of facts, in that we choose the facts to observe and the way that we perceive them. There's so many facts out there. We choose the ones that we want to. And which ones do we choose? We choose the ones that fit our paradigm. And he is saying that there are literally millions of observed facts which simply do not appear in scientific writing because they tend to raise doubts about the prevailing paradigm. It doesn't fit their paradigm. And there are things that happen to us out in the Amazon that would not fit the scientific method, would not fit the scientific mind of being rational. You would say, well, that was not rational. There had to have been a power. There had to have been something else involved. And the Western mind would say, no, it is all explainable through cause and effect and natural processes. And if I can't, then I discard it. I'll just wait until I can come up with an explanation that is natural. So in other words, they won't look at that if it is unexplainable. We will look at what fits our paradigm. Critical thinking and the sources of reliable knowledge. Intuition, external authority, reason, empiricism. Now the question is, how would ethno-epistemology fit into this paradigm? Is there, of the 4, is there a source of reliable knowledge that an indigenous group would agree with? Or are these 4 limited to the Western world and what they would choose? Maybe there's a different epistemology or different method, different source that a non-Westerner ethno-epistemology would choose to work with. What we're doing is just giving a counter view or a more global view and putting into context when we're talking about critical thinking in science. We're talking about something very specific. We're talking about something very culturally determined specific, which would be a Western culture. And so the question would be, okay, what if we're a non-Western? Can we still critically think? And the answer to that would be, because of the parameters established by the Western culture, then the answer would probably be no, you're not critical thinking. You're coming up maybe with reliable knowledge. Maybe it's even true reliable knowledge, but it's not justified. because it doesn't go through the scientific method. So that is what we're looking at, is that, okay, is the scientific method, it's a good method, is it the only method? And some have said it is the only method that will produce reliable knowledge. Can I use any other method? Can I use experience? Can I use tradition? Can I use, and the answer would, from the Western perspective, you can, and it might even produce something true, but not justifiable. So therefore, it would have to be discarded as not reliable knowledge. This is session number 5, Knowledge and Wisdom. We're Tim and Holly. You're welcome to communicate with us through those addresses. This is chapter number 6, Knowledge and Wisdom, session number 5. Thank you again for joining me.